Welcome to the York Festival of Ideas, running this year under the banner of Virtual Horizons. Sadly, for obvious reasons this year, we're not able to invite you to all the magnificent surroundings of the University of York, who, as you know, are the hosts and originators of this festival. But of course, we look forward to doing that again in the future. But meanwhile, we're delighted that you're joining us online, and we really hope that you enjoy this event. I'm Colin Philpott, by the way. I'm a member of the Court, the advisory body of the university. I'm a writer of 3 historical non-fiction books, former BBC programme maker, and it's my pleasure to introduce our subject and our speaker today. Now, if you go on the Visit Whitby website, it says this, and I quote, "No visit to Whitby would be complete without indulging in Whitby fish and chips." I, for one, would struggle to disagree with that. Many people will have had the pleasure, although I suppose the opportunities to do so are limited to takeaways at the moment, will have had the pleasure of Whitby fish and chips. But I have to confess that I've not really ever thought that much just about exactly why Whitby and fish and chips have become so inextricably linked. But I know a man who knows the answer to this. He's Tom Pickles. He's an academic specialising mainly in ecclesiastical history. He's senior lecturer in history at the University of Chester. His book, Kingship, Society and the Church in Anglo-Saxon Yorkshire, explored the social dynamics of religious conversion and church building in Yorkshire between 400 AD and 1066. Rather a long way, you might think, from fish and chips. But perhaps the most important fact about his CV is that he's a native of Whitby, which I assume accounts for his interest in today's subject. So Tom, tell us all, please, about the origins of Whitby fish and chips.
Well, thank you very much for a very generous introduction. And thank you to those of you watching for coming to hear about the Anglo-Saxon origins of Whitby fish and chips. And you've already been introduced to the link between those two things. If you visited Whitby on the northeast coast of Yorkshire, about 50 miles northeast of York, then it might be because of one of its famous attractions, its historical claims to fame. For instance, the medieval Abbey, which stands overlooking the harbour, or Captain Cook, who famously sailed to Australia, or indeed Whitby Jet, which was worn by Queen Victoria, or even Bram Stoker's Dracula, who came ashore as a dog at Whitby. But you might also have visited Whitby in order to sample its fish and chips at one of its famous restaurants like the Magpie Cafe. I should say there are plenty of other fantastic fish restaurants available in Whitby. If any of these attractions had drawn you to Whitby over the Feast of Ascension, about 40 days after Easter, then you would have witnessed this fantastic, this fascinating medieval ceremony. This is known as the Horngarth or the Penny Hedge. On the eve of Ascension at 9 a.m, the bailiff of a nearby manor at Filing comes to Whitby to construct a hedge on the mudflats of the River Esk in the harbour. That hedge, by tradition, is to be made of 9 hazelwood posts, supported at each end by what are called stowers, and interwoven with 9 further yethers, and then it's infilled with brushwood. To complete the ceremony, the bailiff has to take a ceremonial ram's horn and sound it 3 times in a row and shout 3 times in a row, "Out on ye!" This ceremony seems to have taken place since the 12th century, all the way to the present day, with only, as far as we can see, 2 exceptions, for an exceptionally high tide in 1981 and this year for the COVID-19 lockdown. Its origins have remained a mystery until now. I want to argue that this represents a unique phenomenon and also shows us the origins of Whitby fish, if not chips. A legend that was circulating in the 18th century claimed that this ceremony was the result of the accidental killing of a hermit on a hunting trip in North Yorkshire. But we're going to follow all of the previous historians of Whitby in suggesting that there's a much more interesting alternative explanation. But we'll come back to that legend because it probably is one of the reasons why this has continued to be constructed through to the present day. So if you were standing on the edge of the harbour, witnessing this ceremony, all the same questions would probably occur to you as have occurred to historians of Whitby since the 18th century. What was this Horngarth or Penny Hedge? What was it for? When and how did it originate? Why did people participate in its construction? Why did its original function disappear? And why has its construction continued for at least 800 years? And we'll use these questions as the structure for today's talk. To understand the origins of the Horngarth, we need to start with what Marc Bloch, famous French historian, said was the most exciting bit of any historical problem. And this is the evidence, what he called the site of the investigation, or what I prefer to think of as, why do we think we know what we think we know about a historical phenomenon? The crucial collection for us is this. It's known as the Whitby Abbott's book. It's a manuscript kept in the North Yorkshire County Record Office at Northallerton. And I borrowed this image from a digital reproduction that was put together by the Friends of Whitby Abbey. And you could go and read it if you want in its edition, its Latin edition, and its translation listed here. What is this? This is a collection of all of the documents of the Abbey put together in the 13th century. 5 documents that are preserved in this book tell us everything that we currently know about the Horngarth, which became known later as the Penny Hedge. And it's important just to give a little bit of attention to those 5 documents. The first 3 of them are called charters, and these are grants of land relating the relationship between the abbot and the tenants who held the land on his behalf and worked it for him. The first of these is a deed of Richard de Percy of the small village of Dunsley, just outside Whitby. We're told that Benedict, the abbot of Whitby, has given and granted him some land which was held by his father in hereditary right. And in return for this, he won't have to perform any services. He can just give 2 marks, 2 coins a year, one at Whitsun and the other at the feast of St. Martin, except that he must perform one service, the Horngarth, as much as pertains to his land. The second of these is a charter of William of Everley. Now, Everley is a place about 13 miles away from Whitby, near the modern settlement of Hackness, just near Scarborough, to those of you who aren't locals like me. This tells us that another abbot of Whitby, Richard II, had granted some land to William of Everley, the landholder, and his heirs. And this was land near Whitby at Ogglebarnby, but also at Everley, near Hackness, not far from Scarborough. That was to be held with everything that belonged to it, paying annually 11 shillings, but fulfilling one request in August for 16 men from Ogglebarnby and 8 from Everley to take their part in the construction of this hedge, the Horngarth. The third of these charters is from a Roger Brown concerning a unit of land in North Filing. He says, I've given, granted, and by this deed confirmed to the Lord Roger, Abbot of Whitby, 1 unit of land in North Filing. And let it be known that I fully released it of all services of the Horngarth, including other services which should be performed. Well, in addition to these 3 charters, we have a series of memoranda, records of a dispute that took place between the Abbot of Whitby and one of his men, Alexander of Sneaton, another village not far from Whitby. It's worth just looking through in full the 4th part of these memoranda. And this relates to the Horngarth. Frequently, when the men of the said Alexander are making the Horngarth, they're accustomed to take more than is necessary from the wood of the abbot, and they're in the habit of selling the remainder or the surplus in the town, and then being summoned to the forest court and fined for it. Thus, to end this, it was allowed that the said men shall be free to take neither more nor less timber than they desire from the servants of the abbot. And if a defect in the making of the said Horngarth is seen, having been occasioned by less freedom, it shall not be imputed to them, it shan't be their fault, but such a defect, if indeed it is a defect, will be ours, will be the abbot's and not theirs. But when they demand the third day from which the said Horngarth was constructed, they frequently claim it's lawful on the vigil of the Ascension of the Lord, on which it ought to be constructed. Otherwise, the response is not for them, unless they've been lawfully forewarned. When it's done differently, I accede that sometimes the said vigil will fall on the feast day of St. John of Beverley in East Yorkshire, so it will not be done. The final of our documents is a brief note written in either the late 16th or the early 17th century, you can deduce this from its handwriting, on a flyleaf of that cartulary, the abbot's book. This is someone looking back at this custom of constructing the Horngarth. Whoever it is says, every year the Horngarth service is to be done upon Holy Thursday evening. Thomas Cockrell, being bailiff to the abbot, did meet by sunrise the Conniers, the Strangeways, the Eldringtons and Allotson, who were bound to this service, in the Stry Head, hard by Littlebeck, another village just near Whitby. And the said Cockrell did see everyone cut down with a knife, he appointing the wood so much as should serve. From thence they came not the nearest way, but bringing them upon their back, and went a good way before they came into the way. So coming to the water at the town end, they made the hedge, which should stand for 3 tides. And then the officer did blow out upon ye. Though we only have these 5 documents to tell us about the origins of the Horngarth, they actually tell us a remarkably large amount about this construction. The name that's applied to it, Horngarth, is either Old English, the ancestor of modern English, or Old Norse, the ancestor of modern Scandinavian languages. And it seems to mean a hedge. And we can tell that this is constructed from a large amount of the Lord's timber resources. So presumably it's a timber hedge, something like the construction that we see continuing to the present day. We can also deduce the context for it. It was an obligation of lordship. The Lord expected this from his tenants, and he assessed it on the basis of the land that they held, and they had to render it as physical labour, cutting wood, carrying wood to Whitby, constructing the hedge. It fell on a discrete number of lands, mostly around Whitby: Dunsley, Filing, Russup, Slights, Stakesby and Ogglebarnby, and one land near Hackness to the south at Everley. It was probably a much larger scale phenomenon than the small hedge that we see constructed every year at the moment. After all, there were 24 men just from the lands at Ogglebarnby and Everley needed for the construction of this hedge. And we can tell from the memoranda that sufficient timber was taken for the making of this thing, that it was plausible you could steal illicitly from the Lord's timber resources and sell them on in the town. Usually, as in the present day, this took place on the eve of Ascension, but there was some variation, as the memoranda explain. Equally, construction could presumably continue through into August, as one of the charters suggests. And finally, we can see that the Lord would assess the quality of the work that was done by his men by seeing whether the structure could last for 3 tides. So, what was this thing? What is this Horngarth that's been constructed for at least 800 years? And I'm going to argue for even longer. Well, the previous explanations that have been given are creative and interesting, but haven't really convinced. So, the first person to write about this, writing in the 18th century, was a man called Lionel Charlton. And his ideas were taken up by one of the men presented here, the Reverend George Young. And they thought that this was some sort of hedge designed to help for the loading or storing of goods in the harbour. Alternatively, the second man, who's pictured here, Canon Atkinson, the editor of the cartulary and the great expert on the Abbey documents, he suggested that it was named from horned cattle and that this was some sort of hedge put together in the spring to prevent cattle from getting onto the Lord's lands. Finally, Robert Turton, back at the beginning of the 20th century, put together an argument that it was named from its shape and that in fact it stretched all the way from Littlebeck to Whitby, perhaps some 3 miles, and was a great hedge and dyke designed to assist in the hunting of game. But the problem for all of these explanations is, why was this thing constructed on the eve of Ascension? Why was it constructed on the mudflats of the River Esk? And why on earth did it have to last for 3 tides? So I'm going to suggest instead that we can solve the mystery of the Penny Hedge, the Horngarth or the Penny Hedge, and that we can now recognise it as a really fascinating phenomenon, an intertidal fish weir, primarily but not exclusively for salmon. Okay, you may or may not know that the River Esk is the only Yorkshire river, other than the Ouse, which is visited by Atlantic salmon. And here are 2 nice images, supposedly of salmon fishermen from the Whitby Museum photo archive. A good time to catch adult salmon is late May, June and July, precisely the period in which the Horngarth was constructed. We also know that this was a really good time for fish weir building in the agricultural cycle. What we've got here is an Old English text, probably of the 11th century, called On the Prudent or Discriminating Reeve, or estate manager, someone who would run the estate on the Lord's behalf. And it tells us when the appropriate timing was for the undertaking of particular agricultural tasks. And here we have the entry for May and June. In May, June and July, in summer, one may harrow, carry out manure, procure sheep hurdles, shear sheep, build, repair, construct in timber, cut wood, weed, make folds, construct a fish weir and a mill. The eve of Ascension, about 40 days after Easter, is determined, like Easter, by the lunar calendar, by the movements of the moon, and therefore usually, but not always, guarantees a good tide, low tide for construction. And that explains both the timing, but also the variability in its construction. Excavated intertidal fish weirs from the medieval period are indeed wattle hedges or fences like the Horngarth. This is a reconstruction of one from Bunratty in the Shannon estuary in Ireland. And this way of constructing fish weirs continued for a very long time. So here's another example from 18th century France. Particularly well excavated examples have shown that these were complex enterprises requiring timber and labour on a scale equivalent to those suggested in the Horngarth obligations. For instance, there's one that's been excavated on the Blackwater Creek in Essex, which comprised something like 10,000 roundwood posts, 10 to 15 centimetres in diameter, set at about 50 centimetre intervals, and enclosing something like 3,000 by 700 metres. And these could take 2 different forms, these fish weirs. They could be V-shaped weirs, like the one that we've seen represented here, designed to funnel the fish into various varieties of fish trap. Or they could be linear or curving hedges designed to create eddies in the water so that you could fish from a boat using a stop net. And that may be more likely in the case of the Horngarth or the Penny Hedge. Strikingly, there's a description of an estate at Tiddenham in Gloucestershire, probably from the 11th century again, and in Old English, the ancestor of modern English, which tells us about the duties of peasants called geburas and what they must do. And this supplies a direct parallel for the obligations of the Horngarth. We're told the gebur must perform his duties. He must plough half an acre as week work and himself fetch the seed from the Lord's barn. A whole one for church dues from his own barn, however. For weir construction, he must presumably cut and carry 40 larger or one load of poles, or he must build 8 yokes, presumably 8 sections, for 3 tides, presumably to last 3 tides. And this looks very much like the cutting, carrying, construction duties that we see for the Horngarth and the idea of the duration of 3 tides. Just like the name Horngarth, the names which were applied to fish weirs in the ancestors of our modern languages, Brittonic or Old Welsh, the ancestor of modern Welsh, Old English and Old Norse, emphasised the material characteristics and described them as wooden, wattle, woven fences or hedges of this type. So in Old Welsh, we get things to do with being plaited or bound or woven like corridow and argai. Or in Old English, we get things relating to fences like hack weir and tanned weir. Or we get things relating to the construction materials like beam weir, tree or wood weir, ash or plum weir, presumably relating to the tree material from which it was constructed. Or in Old Norse, famously, we get fishgarth in Wales, fiskigarth, the fish hedge, or ever, sand or gravel bank weir. Well, separated though I am from you in time and space, I know that this extraordinary revelation that the Whitby Horngarth was a medieval intertidal fish weir has prompted you to applause, perhaps even wild cheering, and I should probably let that subside. But I'll press on instead. We need to think about those questions that you raised, standing by the harbour, witnessing the construction of the Horngarth. And we'll start with the first of these. When and how did it originate? Well, we've seen that it's got maybe an Old English or an Old Norse name. And these were languages spoken in what's now England before the Norman conquest of 1066. So maybe it's got Anglo-Saxon origins. But frustratingly for us, they continued to be spoken beyond 1066 too. So this is suggestive but not conclusive. We've also seen that the best parallel for the obligations of lordship comes from a pre-1066 text. So that might add a little bit of weight to the idea that it's Anglo-Saxon. But most striking of all to me is the fact that it falls on only a certain number of lands, mostly around Whitby itself. These lands seem to preserve traditions of lordship which go back before the Norman conquest. And to understand that, we need to look at the entry for Whitby and for Hackness in Domesday Book. Domesday Book, pictured here in its translation, was a document put together at the end of William the Conqueror's reign in 1086 or 1088. And this was a survey of all of the landholdings of his conquered kingdom. It includes for us in the Yorkshire sections entries relating to Whitby and Sneaton and to Hackness. And these two manors were the core manors which represented the first endowment for the newly refounded Abbey of Whitby in 1078. We're told that in Whitby and Sneaton, an outlier of land, there were 15 units of land, and to this manor belonged Soke. And this included a number of the lands that we see mentioned in the Horngarth obligations: Filing, Ogglebarnby, Stakesby, Newham. Equally, we're told that at Hackness, there were 2 outlying parts of land that related to the manor of Hackness at Suffield and Everley. These outlying portions of land seem to reflect a pre-conquest tradition of lordship in which the lord of a particular manor had rights to dues and services from the peasant in other outlying landholdings, just like the obligations that we see in the construction of the Horngarth. And I think the fact that the Horngarth fell on lands which were part of these pre-conquest manors and not on other lands which were acquired by the Abbey in the 11th and 12th centuries suggests that this is in fact an Anglo-Saxon phenomenon. So by now, hopefully you're persuaded that what we have here in the Horngarth is the origin of Whitby's reputation for fish, if not for chips at this stage. If this is right, we might think about 4 potential occasions on which it could have originated. It could have originated, firstly, as early as the 6th or 7th centuries AD. By the mid-7th century, at least, there was a royal territory of the kings of the Bernicians and Daerans, the peoples of Northumberland, County Durham, and Yorkshire, focused on Eskmouth, focused on what's now Whitby. And we know this because Bede, writing a history in about 731, tells us that a king of the Bernicians, Oswiu, was overlord of the Daerans and therefore of the people of Yorkshire. And that in 657, he granted 10 households worth of land to Hild for the foundation of a monastery at Whitby. What we're looking at here is a royal centre to which the free peasants of the surrounding area owed various dues and services. And part of that territory, 10 households worth of dues and services, is being granted for the foundation of this monastery. That is the ancestor of the manor of Whitby with its outlying soak, its outlying lands and dues and services that we see several centuries later in Domesday Book. Now, it's likely that the monastery that was founded, Hild's religious community, became pastorally responsible for the people of that royal territory. And we think this because in the 11th and 12th centuries, the Mother Church of St. Mary at Whitby had rights over all of these outlying parishes, which corresponded with the area over which the manor had those outlying lands that owed dues and services. Now, we know that kings like Oswiu itinerated, they moved around to their royal centres in order to collect and consume the dues and services at those centres. And it's possible that an intertidal fishweir like the one at Whitby was constructed to meet these demands. The very earliest name for Whitby was not Whitby, it was Streonachal. And Carol Hough has argued, persuasively I think, that this meant nook of treasure and was applied particularly to productive fishing places, places like Strensall just outside York or Stronsay in Scotland. Just a little later than Oswiu, in the early 8th century, we have a king of a people in what's now southwest England, the West Saxons, who wrote down for us the kind of things that he expected from these royal territories. He called this foster or food rent, and he said, this is the foster from every 10 households. And it was a list of consumable goods, which included 5 salmon. So perhaps Oswiu was travelling to Streonachal, to Whitby, to sample the reputable fish, the salmon, in the 7th century. Alternatively, it could be that the religious community that was founded there devised the Horngarth in the 7th or 8th centuries. Excavations on the headland at Whitby have uncovered the remains from this monastery, depicted here. And they've shown that there was an above average number of coins produced and shared in association with this monastery. And that suggests that it was the site of an interregional market. Some important resource was underpinning that regional market. And it's likely that things like wool and grain from the northeast Yorkshire plains, and indeed fish from the Esk, were what underpins that market. And they probably also allowed the community to do things like construct new stone buildings and stone monuments. One of the monuments is depicted here. Write manuscripts and construct high status metalwork. Now, our recent studies of these early religious communities have suggested that they were real economic innovators. And that included technological innovations like the construction of things like mills and fish weirs. So perhaps the Horngarth goes back to Hild's religious community in the 8th century. If not, then maybe it's a product of what we often refer to now as the Viking diaspora. What do we mean by that term? We mean the raiding, trading, conquests and settlements undertaken by people from what is now Scandinavia from the later 8th century onwards. We know from a dense concentration of place names in Yorkshire, which were Old Norse in origin, the ancestor of modern Scandinavian, that there was probably a very high-level, low-status settlement by Scandinavians in Yorkshire. And you can read Matt Townend's fantastic book on Viking Age Yorkshire if you want to look into this. That community of Scandinavians particularly valued goods which were produced in amber and jet. And jet, as we've seen, is one of the resources at Whitby. And it's been argued by Caroline Coulter, again, I think persuasively, in this volume on everyday objects. That Whitby jet was probably being used by specialist craftspeople in amber and jet in York, in Lincoln, and in Dublin in the 10th century. Quite independently of this, David Stoker has suggested that these monuments found at the parish church of Leith, just 3 miles from Whitby, called hogbacks because of their bowed backs, represent monuments to a community of Scandinavian traders who were operating the axis between the two Scandinavian centres of Dublin and York, and then accessing the North Sea and Scandinavia. Excavations up in the northern and western Isles of Scotland have suggested that these Scandinavians were very adept coastal fishermen as well. So perhaps they invented the Horngarth. Maybe it's not got an Old English, but an Old Norse name. Alternatively, it could belong to the 10th or 11th centuries. In the mid-10th century, the kings of the West Saxons that we saw in southwest England expanded their authority to rule most of what is now England. In Domesday Book, that manor at Whitby was a royal estate in the hands of one of their earls, probably on loan to him. And it was given an exceptionally high valuation, £112, by far the highest valuation of any manor in the Yorkshire Domesday, and very high in national terms. It's likely that something like the exploitation of rare resources like salmon underpins that valuation, which is otherwise inexplicable. The value of things like grain and wool from North Yorkshire is not great enough really to explain that amount of tax. Whether or not we can choose between these four scenarios for the origins of the Horngarth, we can see from the documents that we looked at that its construction continued all the way from the 12th to the 16th centuries at least. So why did people participate in the construction of this huge intertidal fish weir? Well, human motivations, as you will know yourselves, are mysterious things, often obscure to individuals and groups, and historians are very careful not to think we know why people did things in the past. But if we look at the relationship between the abbots and their tenants, we can offer some possible suggestions as to why this might be. The Abbey was the nexus for a series of overlapping economic, social, and religious relationships, which tended to reinforce one another. From about the year 1000, what we call the fish event horizon resulted in the huge exploitation of offshore herring and cod. And this brought fishermen to Whitby from the eastern coast of Britain, yes, but also from northern France, from the Low Countries, and from Scandinavia. And that was particularly true in the months of August and September, when the herring shoals travelled down to visit this region of the North Sea. And you can have a look at the Barrett and Orton edited volume Cod and Herring, which is a fantastic overview of this. In turn, that economic network put the sheep farmers of Yorkshire into contact with the cloth makers of the Low Countries and of northern Italy. And you can read about this from T.H. Lloyd or from Susan Rose. These two networks, in turn, fostered urbanisation, the growth of a town for the first time at Whitby. And our first evidence for this, you can see, is in the last decade of the 12th century. We get the Abbott offering a charter of liberties to the townspeople, the burgesses of Whitby. By about 1300, tax records show us that there were up to 700 people living in the town at Whitby, and they were undertaking a whole range of occupations, things like grocer, brewer, barber, baker, bricklayer, tooltaker, porter, cobbler, goldsmith, tailor, fuller, and dyer. And this places Whitby in the fourth rank of our Yorkshire towns at this point, not as big as places like York and Beverley, but comparable to places like Ripon and Selby. The Abbey was able to exploit these commercial networks in a range of ways, which complemented its rights as a lord over lands and as a religious centre with rights over the parishes of the surrounding territory. So, for instance, by the mid-12th century, the Abbey had become the most important landholder in the two mother parishes focused on its two central manors of Whitby and Hackness, and that's the area represented by this red line on the map. As a result, it could expect people to visit, particularly Whitby, on the major Christian festivals, times like Christmas, Easter, Ascension Tide, Michaelmas and Martinmas. Like other lords, we can see from the Abbott's book that the Abbots used this as a convenient set of occasions on which the obligations of lordship should be discharged. So things like attending the Lord's court at Easter or paying your rents at Whitsun and Martinmas. In the 10th century, the relics of Hild, the founder of the original abbey in the 7th century, had been lost. They'd been taken to Glastonbury. But in the 12th century, sometime between the 1130s and the 1170s, the Abbots had some of those relics translated back to Whitby. And they chose a suitable occasion for the translation of those relics so that they could establish a feast day on which people would have to travel to Whitby. And they chose the 25th of August, perfectly timed for the herring fleets who were arriving in Whitby. Then in the last decade of the 12th century, they established for themselves a huge immunity from royal administration. They were no longer subject to the king's administrators in various ways. And this was known as the Liberty of Whitby Strand, and again, it's outlined by the red line on this map. And this included their direct lordship over the town and the port of Whitby, but also a fair on that feast day on the 25th of August when the herring fleets were in, with peace over 3 days. The memoranda that we looked at show us that the Abbots had cleverly given special privileges of buying and selling in the town to some of their rural tenants to encourage them to spend their surplus goods and income in the town. And as a result of all of this, they generated a lot of income from Whitby. So we can see that they asserted their rights to tithes over the thousands of herring that were being landed at Whitby in the 12th century. Around about 1200, they could agree to send some 2,000 herrings annually to Thornton-le-Dale across the moors for the Hospital of St Leonard's at York without really affecting their overall herring catches and rights. Similarly, we can see that they were able to impose themselves as an intermediary with those merchants from the Low Countries and from northern Italy in the sale of fleeces for the making of cloth. So our accounts from Whitby show us that the community had something like about 4,000 sheep. But one of our merchants, Francesco Pegolotti, writing in the 14th century, thought that Whitby could supply 30 sacks of wool, or the fleeces from about 6,000 sheep, suggesting they're getting a lot in from other people. And indeed, we can see them acting as intermediaries on particular occasions. If we think about the Horngarth in the context of all of this information that I've just thrown at you, then we can consider that people probably participated in its construction for a variety of reasons. First, we have to imagine that this was only constructed because people continued to have a consensus about the value of its construction, both to the Lord and to the tenants. After all, what we've seen is that the Lord's Court once a year in those memoranda, and the transfer of lands on less regular occasions were opportunities for the Lord and the tenants to renegotiate the terms of this agreement, and perhaps even to get rid of it if it's no longer seen to be of value to both parties. We've also seen from the memorandum that acts of petty resistance on an annual basis could undermine its construction. You could fail to respond to the requests of the Lord to construct it on time. You could not build it to a sufficient quality to withstand the 3 tides. And you could exploit loopholes opportunistically to steal timber from the Lord's resources and sell them without him knowing. So why was there a consensus amongst these people about building this thing? Well, within the seasonal rhythms of lordship, production, and commerce, the Ascension Tide construction of the fish weir was part of a broader set of necessary moments of cooperation between the people of the northeastern coastal plains and the owners of the only estuary through which goods could be transshipped at Whitby. It also represented a construction that complemented but didn't conflict with other duties of the agricultural year, as we've seen. It was therefore part of a broader web of social relationships, which seemed habitually rational. We do it all the time, and to rethink any one part of it might cause you to rethink the whole. If we pull part of this apart, does the whole come apart? Equally, because of the skill and labour that was required for its construction, it reflected a balance of power and agency between the abbot and his tenants. People probably continued to construct it partly because, as we see in the memoranda, their labour could be used as leverage to renegotiate their relations with the abbot on an annual basis. I'm right about this. If this is an intertidal fish weir, and if these are the reasons why people perhaps continued to construct it from the 12th to the 16th centuries, why did its original function disappear? Why do we not know now that this was an intertidal fish weir? At some point between the 16th and the 18th centuries, it ceased to serve its original function and signify that original function as an intertidal fish weir. That note on the flyleaf of the abbot's book starts off in the present tense. This is still done. But then it moves into an historical sketch based on the tenants who held land in the early 16th century and the custom as it used to be performed. Someone obviously thought it was in danger of disappearing. By the 18th century, a new invented tradition was circulating. This was recorded word by word for us by this man, Lionel Charlton, in his history of Whitby and of Whitby Abbey. It claimed that the Horngarth originated in the reign of King Henry II and precisely in the 5th year of his reign in 1159. It told us that it originated in a hunting trip by some of the tenants on whose lands this obligation fell. During that hunting trip, they travelled to this place a hermitage at Eskdale Side that was owned by the Abbey. You can see it from above here. You can go and have a look at the ruins if you would like. While they were there, they killed a hermit in whose hermitage their prey was taking refuge. Fatally wounded, he was visited by the Abbot of Whitby, and with his dying breath, he imposed a penance on those tenants. He said their lands must now be subject to the Abbot, and annually they must construct this hedge, and if they failed to do so, then their lands would be forfeit. This is a wonderful romantic story located in the 12th century. Unfortunately, it's almost certainly not true. So Charlton, followed by Young, who we saw earlier, and Atkinson, pointed out all of the historical inconsistencies in this that undermine the story. It focused on an Abbot Sedman of Whitby, who we know never existed. The names of the tenants who were given were not the tenants as we know them from the Abbot's book during the reign of Henry II. These lands were already subject to the Abbot at that point. They didn't need to come newly under his jurisdiction. And the relationship between the Abbot and the Hermit seems anachronistic. All in all, this looks like an oral or antiquarian just so story, created from a knowledge of the way things were done in the 16th century and the tenants who held land then, and back projecting it into the 12th century. Why then had that original function been lost? Well, the answer to this, I think, probably lies in the English Reformation, the alum trade, and the rise of the English shipping industry. In 1539, Henry VIII's agents came to dissolve the monastery at Whitby, and this diverted its revenues, some £400 and more per year, usually spent in the town and port, first to the royal court, and then to a series of people who held those revenues on lease. One family of leaseholders, the Chumleys, bought up land around Whitby and established a magnificent residence for themselves adjacent to the Abbey, which is now the Abbey Visitor Centre. But they couldn't replace the Abbey as a fiscal stimulus to the town, which seems to have gone into decline, and they ran up huge debts during the English Civil War, for which see Jack Bin's study of Sir Hugh Cholmondeley of Whitby. However, in 1608, prospectors came to the rescue of Whitby by discovering alum in the hills to the north and west. And here is a depiction of one of the alum quarries at its height from the Scarborough Art Gallery. Alum is a mineral crucial to the fixing of dye in cloths, and it was incredibly valuable. To process and transship that alum required huge amounts of coal, which was brought in from Newcastle, and, believe it or not, urine, which was brought in from London. This fostered a shipbuilding tradition at Whitby. People put together a fleet of some 100 ships by the 1670s, which serviced this industry. And this made Whitby maybe the 5th or 6th largest port in Britain at this point. This then was the foundation on which rested Whitby's contribution to whaling, represented here by William Scoresby and the Whitby Whalebone Arch, and also to voyages of scientific and geographic discovery, represented by Captain Cook and the replica of his ship H.M. Endeavour in Whitby. These changes had several effects pertinent to the Horngar. First, the Reformation severed fundamentally the relationship between the abbots and their tenants on which the construction of the fish weir had rested. Hence, presumably by the late 16th, early 17th century, people were looking back on what this odd, this curious phenomenon was. Equally, they reduced the relative significance of both intertidal and offshore fishing to the economy of the town and replaced it with shipbuilding, industrial transshipment and whaling. And thirdly, they required a redevelopment of the harbour to make way for these much larger vessels that were operating requiring new staithes, new warehouses, a new landscape in which that intertidal fish weir was a hindrance to much more valuable economic activity. Why then has its construction continued? Despite the loss of its original construction, the answer seems to be that the people of this area invented that romantic tradition about the hermit, which became crucially important to the local and national reputation of the town. So where did it come from? The seeds for this lay in a longer-term interaction between historical texts and oral storytelling, which has been thought about by Adam Fox in his wonderful book on oral and literate culture in England. This meant that people invented orally traditions about landscape features which were rooted in more or less real or fictional historical pasts. And they've been explored by people like Alexandra Walsham in The Reformation of the Landscape, or by Andy Wood in his study of customary memory. We can see the culture within which this story was created by thinking about a series of stories which were picked up by antiquarians and visitors to Whitby in the 16th, 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. First of these begins in the 12th century and continues to be told through to the present day. In the 12th century, the people of Whitby were telling two new miracles about their saint, St. Hilda, and these were picked up and written down in a now lost life of St. Hild, which we know from a book list in the Abbey of about 1176. And we know what was in it because it was used as the basis for two later lives of St. Hild, one in the Romsey Legendary, another written by John of Tynemouth, and an Anglo-Latin poem about her life. These miracles were first that Hild was able to command the snakes, presumably the adders of the North York moors, to throw themselves over the cliff and turn to stone, the Ammonites of the Jurassic coastline. And this fostered a tradition of snake stones at Whitby with magical properties. The second miracle said that Hild was able to miraculously imprison geese, migratory geese, who were attacking her crops. And when she found that one of them had died on liberating them, she was able to resurrect it and send it back into the skies. Quite independently of our texts for this set of miracles, we can see these stories being told orally and picked up by antiquarians in the area in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries. By the 19th century, we can pick up other stories about Hild, that she was born in the nearby village of Aylesby, that she spent her youth here at Hinderwell, which carries her name, the Well of Hilda, and that there is a miraculous spring there as a result. Or that a spring on the boundaries of that liberty that I showed you, called Hilda's Well, was a favourite place that she would travel to. Other stories surrounding the North York moors were picked up by antiquarians and historians, and they rooted the past of this landscape and its places in real or fictitious members of early Anglo-Saxon religious and noble families. They're quite curious stories. We're told that King Aldfrith of the Northumbrians died in 705 in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and that he was died or was buried at Driffield in the East Riding of Yorkshire. By the 18th century, people thought that he'd fought a battle on the southern flanks of the North York moors, a place near Ebbeston, and that he was fatally wounded, retreated to a cave, in fact we now know a prehistoric cave, where he rested before he was transferred to Driffield. And a little grotto, as you can see, was constructed in his memory there. To the north of the North York moors, people were telling stories about Rosebery Topping, depicted here, and Osmotherley. A mythical wife of the very real King Oswald of the Northumbrians was said to have been prompted in a dream to flee to Rosebery Topping to try and protect her newborn son, Prince Oswiu. Unfortunately, he was said to have drowned in a spring which miraculously appeared on Rosebery Topping. And she and he were therefore transported for burial at Osmotherley, which gained its name believe it or not, from Oswiu by his mother lay, wonderful piece of folk etymology. A very obscure figure called Duke Wada is recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for 798 as having rebelled against King Eardwulf of the Northumbrians at Whalley in Lancashire. Some people thought that he was the person, Duke Wada, who'd given his name to Mulgrave Castle, that he'd constructed the castle, to a monument called Wade Stone, not far from the castle in the parish of Leith, and to Wade's Causeway, this wonderful, probably Roman road stretching across the North York moors. Most notoriously of all, Robin Hood's Bay was said to have been named from its association with the fleet of Robin Hood. And these two markers mark the sites of Robin Hood and Little John stones or crosses. And these, we were told in the 18th century, originated when Abbot Richard of Whitby dined with Robin Hood and his men, and they fired arrows from the Abbey which landed on these locations. Well, the story that the Horngarth originated not as an intertidal fish weir, as I'm sure I've persuaded you, but as a penance imposed by a hermit with his dying breath on some landholders responsible for killing him. That story belongs to this same cultural tradition. But it was also important, and it remained important to the people of Whitby. And we might wonder whether that was so, because it connected them to their lost pre-Reformation past. The monasticism, the monks and the hermits of that landscape, and even the Catholic tradition of penance within that historic past. It allowed them to create a connection to that past through its continued construction, while also recognizing that it was now something that was other to them. It was lost, it was gone. Despite the changed environment, this attractive, this romantic story ensured that the construction of the Horngarth continued. So here we've got Captain Francis Grose, who wrote a wonderful Antiquities of England and Wales, a multi-volume study designed to popularise places for people who didn't have the money or the leisure to travel to see them. And he included the Hermitage and a word-for-word transcription of that invented tradition about the hermit in his volume. And this helped popularise the idea. In the 19th and 20th centuries, you could look at British newspapers online to see that standard notices began to be circulated around the national press for local newspapers, telling this curious story about the Horngarth and the penance imposed by the hermit. So famous was it that it made its way into Sir Walter Scott's epic best-selling medieval poem, Marmion. So alongside St Hild, the ruins of her abbey, the Ammonites, Captain Cook, Whitby Jet, Bram Stoker's Dracula, this became an important part of the history and memory of Whitby, of its local identity and of its national reputation. And it's still promoted today by official and unofficial tourist sites, and it's the name of businesses in the town, all of whom tend to tell the story, the romantic story of its origins. Well, the history of the Horngarth, like most history, is interesting for its own sake. But it's also an important window onto the social significance and cultural significance of fishing and of fish weirs more specifically. Aidan O'Sullivan, in a fantastic analysis of the growing material evidence, the archaeological evidence for fish weirs, has argued that estuarine landscapes were storehouses of cultural values and traditions, that medieval fish weirs were expression through material culture of the identities of local fishing communities. He suggests that these people, through their daily work and practice within their estuarine environments, their knowledge and understanding of place and their perception of the past, could have used these structures to construct, negotiate, even resist changing social identities within the worlds in which they lived. I'd like to suggest that the Horngarth, with its rare historical detail, is a concrete demonstration of what Aidan O'Sullivan's suggested, probably originating along with a reputation for Whitby fish in the Anglo-Saxon period, maybe as early as the 7th or 8th centuries, perhaps in the 10th century, certainly by the 11th century. And it continued to be constructed as an intertidal fish weir, as an important focus for social organisation from the 12th to the 16th centuries. Even after its original function and significance disappeared, it remained a significant focus for storytelling that allowed the people of this area to negotiate really profound religious, social, and economic changes. And it continues to be really crucial to them to the present day. And if you'd like to find out more, not about the Horngarth specifically, but about Anglo-Saxon Yorkshire, then please do visit my research profile at the University of Chester. And you might even like to ask a library near you to get a copy of my recent book.
Thank you, Tom. That was absolutely fascinating. And I mean, one thing that it made me think about was there are these sorts of historical narratives and traditions about all sorts of places, aren't there, all over the country? And it makes you wonder, whether there are many others that have got similarly sort of, if you like, sort of dodgy explanations of, there must be, presumably.
Yeah, I've wondered the same. I mean, I've known about this obviously since early childhood, and my dad was a history teacher, and my dad and my uncle ran the Whitby Museum in their retirement. So I've known about this for a very long time and in a lot of detail. And it was really genuinely last year that I started to stumble across the probable origins of it, because I didn't know about the archaeology of fish weirs. I didn't know about that Hiddenham estate survey and the idea of things lasting 3 tides and the obligations. And it was only as a result of all that that I realised that there might be an alternative explanation for it. And it does make me wonder how much more expert knowledge needs to be brought to bear on various of these local traditions that exist. And how one would do that, I don't know. No doubt someone like Aidan O'Sullivan would have been better placed than I was to uncover the origins of that. So it's bringing the right person, I think, sometimes into contact with the right material to realise what it represents.
I mean, I suppose you could argue in some cases it doesn't matter if people, if it's about people sort of having a sense of identity about where they live and where they work, that, sometimes these things, they may be inaccurate, but they might be harmless.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I don't think there's any more truth or value, if you like, in the explanation that I've given here. I mean, I deal a lot when I'm looking at ecclesiastical history with very localised traditions of devotion that people have developed, sometimes about parts of their churches and the age of parts of those churches. And I don't see it as my place to want to correct that or suggest that there's a single understanding of that. Clearly, our understandings are memories that develop over time, and they always have value in and when they're being recalled and told as stories. Yeah.
And just a couple of sort of practical things about, why was it constructed to resist 3 tides specifically? Do you know?
This is a very good question, and one I'd meant to touch on. Probably, I think, given the scale of it, we don't mean 3 successive tides. So what we mean is the spring, middle, and neap tides, which would be 1 month. And that's a matter, I guess, both of durability. It needs to last for that length of time, but also of height, because you want to guarantee a decent catch. So you want to be able to catch some, but not all, of the migrating salmon as they're passing through, depending on the height of the water. So I would guess that that's the explanation of it.
You said that the season went on, so it's this time of the year, isn't it? May, June, July. So you might have expected it to, they wanted it to have lasted longer than a month even, but maybe it would have been impossible to construct something that strong.
It seems as if the charter, which refers to labour in August, it may be telling us that it wasn't always just associated with ascension tide, that maybe different landowners came at different points to construct it, or perhaps there was repair and remaking. That's what we see in the archaeology of these things. They exist for centuries, sometimes being built and rebuilt and repaired and modified. So the one that I talked about from Collins Creek, was there from the 7th to the 10th centuries. We've got radiocarbon dates on that one, I think. Yes, I think you're right. They might have wanted them to last longer. And I should say, I've played up the idea of salmon because I think salmon is probably the most valuable fish in this instance. But these weirs were good for catching a range, actually, of riverine fish. So it wasn't just the migratory salmon. And you're right, I think they might have wanted them to last for longer than that.
And who actually makes sure that I know it obviously hasn't been done this year for obvious reasons, but who's responsible for doing it now?
Well, it is actually still the bailiff of the manor of Filing. So there's one remaining land from which the landholder hadn't acquired exemption from this tradition. And now, so far as I understand it, it's done as a kind of customary tradition, a courtesy to the people of Whitby, rather than because they think if they don't do it, that their rights to land will cease to exist. But they do it every year on that basis. And I would very much, if they ever watch this or I manage to get in touch with them, like to chat with them, because I presume that the making of this, there's a ceremonial hammer and a ceremonial horn. There's a tradition about how it's hammered into the ground and about how it's woven and the brushwood is put in. And there's obviously the tradition about the sounding of the horn and the shouting at the end of it. And I presume all this has been handed down from bailiff to bailiff, because we can definitely see that this has been being done for hundreds of years. So it's a fascinating example of person to person handing down of tradition, I think.
I mean, I've been to Whitby a lot, but I haven't actually ever witnessed this. I mean, presumably you've witnessed it. It's a big deal, is it?
Depends on the year, I think, a little bit. But yes, one thing you can't quite make out from those photos, there were others that were passed on to me, is there's quite often a crowd of people. If you go to YouTube and you put in the Penny Hedge, you will find a couple of very good videos, one made in 2015, recording the phenomenon. And you get quite a crowd of people turn out on the harbour side to witness it.
Well, great. It's been a really fascinating talk about something which I have to say I didn't know much about before we started, and it's really fascinating. And thank you very much. And thank you to everybody who's joined us online for this. If you want to see a recording of this, please go to yorkfestivalofideas.com and there's a watch again section where you can see this. And more generally, if you want to find out more about the festival, please go to the website. We really welcome any feedback, and I'm sure Tom would as well. Please use the hashtag York Ideas if you're giving feedback on Twitter or any other social media. But thank you again, Tom. Thank you, everybody. Thank you from the York Festival of Ideas team. Look after yourselves. Stay safe. Thank you.